Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Let's Have Renaissance, a podcast about literature and the arts. I am Ito Otini.
And I'm Makaya Otini, and today we're speaking with Christopher Merrill. Christopher is a journalist, poet, and educator. For 25 years, he conducted cultural diplomacy missions on behalf of the U.S. State Department, traveling the world and liaising with writers and artists on every inhabited continent. His work, including 6 collections of poetry and 6 books of nonfiction, has been translated into over 40 languages. We're excited to be with him today.
Thank you for tuning in. We're excited that you're here. Why don't you also subscribe, like, comment, and share this episode with your friends?
And if you know anyone who wants to come on the podcast, please do send them our way. Also, if you haven't yet, sign up for our free newsletter where we share updates, resources, and opportunities. To support the podcast, you can make a one-time donation through our website or purchase a subscription to our blog where you'll find more premium content and resources at thedatekeepers.com. Thank you for being a part of our community.
Christopher, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you. Can you please tell us about yourself and what are you working on now?
What a pleasure to be here. Thank you. Well, I'm working on now a biography of my first ancestor in the New World, Roger Williams, who is the Puritan divine who gave us the idea of the separation of church and state. It's been a long distance to this book that I'm working on now, and I'll tell you a little something about how that came to be. I grew up in New Jersey, where as a teenager, there were only 2 things I wanted to do. One was to play professional soccer, and the other was to be a poet. As things worked out in my life, I did play soccer through college and then coached at the college level, the collegiate level for a season. The first poem that I published in a good literary journal was titled A Boy Juggling a Soccer Ball. And the first prose book I wrote was a book about the 1990 World Cup in Italy, The Grass of Another Country, a journey through the world of soccer. Around that time, I started writing different kinds of books. I covered the wars of succession in the former Yugoslavia, and that turned into a small book about refugees and humanitarians, and then a much longer book about the war, Only the Nails Remain, Scenes from the Balkan Wars. Went on to then write a book about pilgrimages to Mount Athos, the center of Eastern Orthodox monasticism, and a book about travels in Malaysia, the Middle East, and China. Most recently, in terms of prose, a book titled Self-Portrait with Dogwood, which was a book of a kind of a memoir refracted through the lens of the dogwood tree. It was part of an aborted journey or series at Trinity University Press called The Life of Trees. I ended up being the only writer to actually complete a book. But all that time, for the last 10, 12 years, I've been thinking a great deal about some genealogy my father dug up. And I was looking through it and seeing a family history on my father's side of congregational ministers in New England, and kept going back and found Roger Williams as the very first. And I said to my father, well, we actually have somebody interesting in our background. Williams is somebody who I've been thinking about, reading about, writing about for many years now. He was a man who escaped from England and then the Puritan theocracy in New England. And when he escaped or was banished by Massachusetts Bay Colony, he was a gifted linguist and he had learned most of the Algonquian languages. And they housed him in the coldest winter in memory in Massachusetts. And in the spring, he rode down the river into Narragansett Bay and set up shop and eventually created the first colony in the New World that enshrined in its charter the freedom of religion, in which everybody would have a legitimate stake in the outcome of any political process.
You traveled a lot. Can you share some stories about your experiences abroad?
Well, here's a good example. In 2011, spring of 2011, I brought several writers on a cultural diplomacy mission. First to Nepal, where we had the good luck to address universities with hundreds and hundreds of students in the audience. And on the last day, we had a few hours free. And our host at the U.S. Embassy suggested that we book a flight to fly up around the Himalayas and to see Mount Everest. And that excited us. And they said to us, we had to go out to that airport about 6:15 in the morning. And if we weren't on the way by 8:15, we would have to just bag it because we had other places to be with the embassy. And so we went out there at 6:15 and we saw one plane after another take off and we kept being ignored. And finally, everybody was gone except for us and they put us onto a plane. We went out onto the runway. It was now 8:15 and we were sitting out there on the runway and we could hear this rattling in the engine. and nobody said anything, but we thought, this can't be good, whatever that rattling is. It sounded like a ball bearing.
Wow.
And then, maybe 15 minutes pass and we hear the rattling and we think, oh, that's bad. But we take off. And once we get in the air, the rattling goes away. And I think you could feel a great sense of relief. We start flying up and up and up. And then we break through the clouds and we can just see the Himalayas and we can see Mount Everest. And the flight attendant comes down the aisle and says, there is bad weather ahead, so we are going to have to return to the airport. Well, it was clearly not the bad weather because we basically dove straight down toward the airport and landed. And one of the writers with me, as soon as we got on the runway, flipped open her phone and she turned to me and she said, I think that Osama bin Laden has just been killed. She was getting all these messages from her relatives in the Middle East and in South America. So the next stage of our journey was to go to the UAE for a couple of days and then to Afghanistan. When we went to check in for our flight to Afghanistan, to Kabul on a Friday evening, close to midnight, and there were 4 of us who were going to be going there, everybody was able to check in except me because the gate agent said, well, your visa is expired. And I said, how can it be expired? I haven't even gone there yet. And it turned out that it was supposed to be for 3 months, but they'd just written 1 month's plural. So I called the State Department and our program officer got on the horn with somebody in the visa office and they said, just, you've got to find a way to get in. They gave me a boarding pass. We flew to Kabul. And mind you, Osama bin Laden has just been killed. And we were at war in Iraq and in Afghanistan because of Osama bin Laden. Customs and immigration at the Kabul airport took one look at my expired visa and took my passport and said we would have to work this out. So it appeared that it was going to be hard for me to leave Afghanistan. And so I was there. We did our mission over the course of the next several days. And then I was stuck in Kabul, staying in a hooch at the embassy. And so for that next week, I, got to partake of life in an embassy because I was, in a way, now persona non grata. And, those sorts of stories occurred with great regularity over the course of my travels to places like Iraq and Iran and the Congo and Libya and Saudi Arabia. My travels were not to glamorous places, but they were almost always to very interesting places.
So what is life like in an embassy?
Well, one thing that happened that I found quite interesting, it turned out they had a book club.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, I was invited to go to the book club one day because they had a special speaker. And there were no introductions made because there were diplomats there and military people and spies and all kinds of people. So it was a sort of unwritten rule that you didn't talk about who you were or who you were working with. And as it happened, they had somebody coming through a guy named Brian Fisher, who had a new book out, and he was an expert on Al-Qaeda. And so they were having a special session of the book club to talk with him about where he saw things were going to go now that bin Laden had been killed. And it was such a lively conversation. It's like any kind of office, except guns are firing with great regularity and a war is on. But you find a way to make some sense out of your time, as these people were doing by reading different books. Usually they were reading novels and talking about them, but for this, they were reading excerpts of Brian's new book. And it led to a very lively conversation about the future of counterterrorism operations, which, for a poet and a writer was absolutely illuminating.
Did they prefer novels that were in some sense escapist and took them out of the daily reality that they were living, or did they prefer novels that were, mirror images of the world in which they were living?
Well, as you might imagine, one of the books that they had read was The Kite Runner, because it was set in Afghanistan. But some of the novels would pertain to the immediate situation they were in, and some would have a wider view.
One thing I find rather interesting about your creative output is you see a lot of poets who also write memoir, but you don't see as many poets who are also journalists. How does your journalism influence your poetry and vice versa? And maybe can you share some examples of how your creative process has been influenced by the fact that you work in both of these forms.
Yeah. The reason there's so much journalism is that for about 10 years, that's how I made my living as a freelance writer. Each of my books is, in my mind, quite different and operates in different ways. And what I've found is the first book, in a way, both the first book of poems and the first prose book, feel like gifts to me. I wrote them with, absolutely no idea of where I was going. But I wouldn't say that it has made things easier. The only thing it has made easier is that I know now at this, I'm 69 years old, that if I'm having a bad day writing, that I've been through this before, and I don't imagine that to mean it's the end of my writing life. Having some experience of that in the past reminds me that, okay, I've been here before. If I'm faithful to the poem at hand, to the essay I'm trying to write, to the book I'm trying to write, eventually I will figure my way out. That's the nature of art, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you deal with the awareness of the passage of time? I mean, I already have this, and I'm in my 30s, and I can only imagine as I get older, I'm going to become ever more aware that I have a finite amount of time available to me to do the work that I want to do and need to do. And it's difficult to hold that in mind and also make space for writing or any sort of art that you're making to unfold in a nonlinear way, which it always insists on doing. How do you allow yourself the patience to let the work unfold as it needs to unfold, while I'm sure still having that sense of urgency?
Well, that's a really good question, because the fact of the matter is that the older you get, the more time seems to speed up, and you realize how very little time you have left. So you feel the onus of trying to get your work done. My friend, the poet Patty Ann Rogers, liked to say, if it were not for the fact that we were going to die, I would never get anything done.
I love that. Yeah, I agree.
And in a way, deadlines have the same effect on you.
That's why they've got the word dead in them.
Exactly. And so being acutely aware of one's mortality, which you become more acutely aware as the years pass, is a spur to keep at it. Seamus Heaney used to say that the poet has to find some level of luxury in their life so that they can get their work done. And for him, in some ways, when he would teach at Harvard for a semester, he would also give a lot of reading so he would make enough money to go back to Ireland and be able to write without worrying about the money. And then I'm also thinking about Gabriel García Márquez, who once said that the writer has to learn how to rest. Actually, I can tell you a story about García Márquez, if you like, that'll just give you a different picture of the great man. I love García Márquez's novels. And when I was covering the war, I had a journalist friend in Slovenia who was off to Venice for the Venice Film Festival. She was going to cover it for a couple of days and asked me if I wanted to go along. And I thought, that sounds like fun, especially because the main thing she was going to do in Venice was to interview García Márquez. He was going to be there for the film festival. So, we had a wonderful trip over to Venice. And we go to pick up García Márquez at his hotel, and then we're going to bring him to the hotel where von Aschenbach lived in Thomas Mann's Death in Venice. He was going to take part in a panel. So we pick up García Márquez. My friend introduces me to him. I just shake his hand and get in the back of the car. And we're driving along, and my friend says, we'll speak in French. That was the only language we had in common. So we're driving along, and my friend sees there were these billboards that had a very funny ad campaign that spring. Men and women in bathing suits, and the women were topless. And this had something to do with whatever the bathing suits were. So my friend turned to me and said, in English, what's the French word for billboard? And when García Márquez heard her speak English to me, he realized, these are not Slovenians. He speaks English back there. And at that point, the atmosphere turned completely cold. And everything that my friend asked him, every question, he just wouldn't answer it. So we got to the hotel. He looks at her and he says, I hate Americans. Your interview is off. And
Wow.
then he stalks off, and we look at each other. And she says to me, did you say anything to him? I said, you heard, I said nothing to him. So we go into this panel, and the panel discussion was really quite ugly. It was against the Berne Treaty that all countries had signed on to. It's intellectual property rights. Basically, it came down to who owns the film at the end, who has the copyright on it. For many European filmmakers, they have it themselves, but for American filmmakers, it's usually the studio. So the U.S. did not sign on to the Berne Treaty, so it was just trashing the U.S., which, we all know how that goes. But for me, In the last 2-3 weeks before this panel, photographs were emerging of the concentration camps in Bosnia and Croatia that the Serbs had set up. And we had all those same images that we remembered from documentaries about the Second World War. I had assumed, mistakenly, obviously, that what these politically minded artists were going to discuss was the revelation of these concentration camps 100 miles away, just across the Adriatic. But here it was this other thing. And it was funny. George Lucas was on the panel and he was, castigating the U.S. But in the audience were Martin Scorsese and Sean Penn, who were really ticked off because I think they thought, the big political issue of the moment was the revelation of these concentration camps in Europe again. Eventually, my friend did get the interview with Garcia Marquez as long as I wasn't there. But I've often thought since then, the reason you always want to act properly and to be decent to people is because you never know when you might be in the presence of another writer who's going to write about this. And so I did write about Garcia Marquez in an essay, part of which made its way into Only the Nails Remain.
We just were talking about this the other day, about how just like there's those careful you're on camera signs, all writers should have a special shirt that we have to wear, or it should be tattooed on our foreheads, or some sort of warning to the people around us.
Everything you say could be used against you.
We need to Mirandize everyone before every conversation, or even just if we're in a public place where we could overhear.
My friend Pamela Painter has a rule for the workshops that she teaches. If somebody says something really good in a workshop pertaining to whatever story they're looking at, the writer of that story has the right to use that for only a year. And if they don't use it within a year, it's fair game for everybody else there. So, but that's one of the things as writers we always have to negotiate.
Yeah. Can you also tell us about the latest book or a couple books and read a poem or a couple of poems?
Yeah. So the two most recent books of poems one is titled Flares. It's a book of prose poems. And the second is called On the Road to Lviv. That's a book-length poem in blank verse. And I'll say just a quick word about how I came to write the books. Flares consists of 80 prose poems, the majority of which I wrote while I was on the road, traveling to different countries. And I would be teaching creative writing workshops in different places. And my old friend, the poet Marvin Bell, who I wrote 3 books with, he liked to say that teacher always does the exercise. So I would give exercises wherever I might be, and I would do the exercise along with them. It was a way for me to keep my eyes open wherever I was, and then wanting to come up with maybe some words that would work their way into a prose poem. And so it became a kind of secret diary of my travels. And so I'll just read this one. It's called The Zoo. His parachute failed to open, also his reserve chute. And his instructor was on the plane banking toward the Rio Grande, returning to the landing strip on the mesa where they had met in the spring. A man in a free fall, spread eagle on a cushion of air between 2 mountain ranges, is not a metaphor for anything beyond the fact that things end, sometimes spectacularly. This he had known since summer, when she had warned him that it could not continue like this. And now on a cool autumn morning, the diver had never seen such a rush of colors. The cerulean sky, the red soil with which his wife threw pots for the craft shows, the green of the pinon pines. There was smoke on the wind from a burning field. Flecks of blue sparkled in the brown river, and he could almost taste the juniper berries about to be plucked by the magpies. His life did not flash before his eyes as he plummeted toward the earth, his arms flailing like a swimmer dragged out to sea. What came to him instead was a moment in the kitchen with his mother after a school trip to the zoo. She set out on the table a plate with a peanut butter sandwich and a glass of cider, lit a cigarette, and said, "Did you see anything interesting?" And I'll read you the first lines of this book, On the Road to Lviv, which came about in a curious way. I went to Ukraine for the first time in 2006, not long after the Orange Revolution, on a cultural diplomacy mission. And I was being driven west to Lviv in an unheated van. The control officer for my mission, she was a local cultural specialist and a Ukrainian novelist, and then a driver. And this woman was clearly going through menopause because every 5 or 10 minutes in this unheated van, she would roll the window down. She was having a hot flash. And the Ukrainian novelist and I were in the back, and we were so cold, we took out all of our clothes to cover ourselves with from our suitcases and duffel bag to cover ourselves to try to stay some kind of warm. And my teeth were just shaking. They were chattering. And at a certain point, I thought, well, I'll just take notes on what I'm seeing, because I knew that the act of writing would help me to take my mind off how very cold I was. So I just started writing just images that I was seeing along the way. And they fell into iambic pentameter at a certain point. And so I kept writing a poem or notes, whatever it might be, for the duration of that mission. Came home, worked on it a little more, set it aside. 9 years later, just after the Russian Federation invaded and occupied Crimea and big parts of eastern Ukraine, I went back on a second mission, this time with some American writers. And I did the same thing. It's like I picked up the theme and started writing, more and more lines. And what I was thinking as I was on that first mission, I was thinking about Adam Zagajewski's beautiful poem, To Go to Lvov. Lvov was the name before Lviv in Soviet times. Then Adam was sick and he was dying. So that got me writing about Adam. And then, of course, the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine on my 65th birthday, February 24th, 2022. And so by then I had to keep writing, and eventually it turned into this book. So I'll just read you the first few lines to give you a taste of that. The globes of mistletoe in the bare trees in an irradiated area west of Kyiv, a silent colony of children signing prayers in unison, and gloveless women hauling sleds of kindling along the icy path by the soccer pitch on which the SS shot the Jews, and murders of crows clearing the road of carrion, save for the wolf splayed on a drift of snow. The miles unroll in an unheated van, past wheat fields, woods, and telephone poles topped with empty storks' nests spreading out like miters. In every village there is a new church crowned with a green dome, onion-shaped and layered with murals of the Savior resurrected, beyond the statues of the fallen order, of planes and tanks, of a seminarian scorned by his classmates, and a novelist crippled in the Great War, of the Red Rider spurring his horse to fly toward a ladder, nailed to a cross outside a cemetery embellished with blue, green, and orange banners, then castles, cattails, and horse-drawn carriages in which the children huddle under sheepskins, and a pack of stray dogs loping across the road, and tractor-trailers sliding down the hill. So much for gauging what a traveler from the Imperium can document with his own eyes at 30 miles an hour. And then it goes on for about another 900 verses.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Love a good narrative poem. Really appreciate you sharing your time and your work with us.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you for the really excellent questions.
Take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.